So he thinks
But-
carrying on Shabbat is forbidden.
Yes.
So that's fascinating, because no Karaite today that I know of believes that. Shalom and welcome to Hebrew Voices, where I'm here today with Dr. Gabriel Wasserman, who got his PhD from Yeshiva University in New York and then did a postdoc at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Shalom, Gabriel.
Hi.
So we're going to talk today about a book that you translated. The book is called Levush Malchut, and it's a response to a query by a king of Sweden by a Karaite named Mordechai ben Nisan. So there's an entire other section of the book, which is a much larger section of Levush Malchut.
There are two more sections.
Yeah, I know, but the second section that I want to talk about really, at least maybe briefly, is the halachic section. What are some examples of some halachot of Karaite ritual practice that come out in this book that maybe are things that either we wouldn't know about or they're just very interesting, or what are some things that people can learn from this book? Maybe the things that are very well known, but it's confirmed in this book.
Right. So some of the things are very legitimate.
Okay.
Because some are not. Some are, he'll say, there's a commandment in the Torah, we follow it, and the Rabbinites don't. And meaning the Rabbinites do. There are people who violate rules in the community, but there are people who violate rules in all communities. It's like saying Muslims drink wine. Muslims don't, meaning there are Muslims who drink wine, but like saying if you said, oh, if Shiites said Sunni Islam allows drinking wine, that's simply a lie, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So some of them where he says, like, the Torah says you can't take any interest. And he says that this is mentioned many times, and he says the Talmudites reject this commandment entirely. They take usury. And our sages of blessed memory do not agree with this at all. So there's an old anti-Semitic trope of Jews being usurers. Now, the Torah permits taking usury from non-Jews. It says very much, it says your brother you can't take usury from the Gentile you can.
So it's not an anti-Semitic trope, meaning that there's a loophole that allows them to take interest. How is it an anti-Semitic trope?
The anti-Semitic trope that Jews extort, that Jews take exorbitant interest rates.
Here's the question of the definition of usury. And he's writing in Hebrew, so he definitely doesn't use the word usury. He talks about neshech and tarbit.
What? Yeah.
Neshech.
What?
All right.
Yeah. Neshech and tarbit. Yeah.
Okay. So in other words, in other words, he's seeing the Rabbinites have all these bankers, and money lenders, and he's saying, maybe he thinks you're not allowed to take it from anybody, not just from non-Jews.
The verse says if he does, then he does. No, he says. There's an explicit verse in the Torah that says et hanochri tashich v'dachicha lo tashich.
All right, so lend an interest to the non-Jew, but to your brother you will not lend an interest.
That is clear.
Depending on the definition of interest or usury, right?
Brother.
Exactly. So there's a lot of definitions here that we don't have time to legislate.
There is now I think probably what he's referring to is there are certain circumstances which I admit I don't know much about that allow within Rabbinite Judaism certain loopholes, as you might call them, which allow having a bank, allowing such a thing as a bank. Modern society wouldn't be able to function without it. And the bank is not a legal person. And banks function. I don't know exactly how this works.
Isn't there heter iska where you're actually borrowing from the bank?
Yes. So I do know certainly from living in Orthodox Rabbinite communities that certainly any loan that takes place in any kind of ordinary situation is always, people not only do not take interest, but are very careful on, like, if somebody lends me, if somebody lends me $15 and I come back and I say I have only a 20, they won't take it and make a point of. So if he is talking about this heter iska, which again is something I should know more about, but I don't know more about, it's limited to very certain circumstances, he should have said so. This is not how he.
I mean,
He
from
says
his-
they
from his
completely
perspective-
ignore. He says they reject this guy. And again, I don't know what loopholes existed in the Karaite community.
Yeah, I don't either.
I don't know. As my friend, a friend of mine read this book, and he said, he said, if everyone's living on absolute basic subsistence and there's a really limited economy, yes, I understand how you can have no equivalent of heter iska. But if there's any kind of economy, there's got to be something. There's got to be something. And again, it's not taking, meaning, are there banks? Are there? And he says, I don't know. He says, again, it would be interesting to see, are there banks in Eastern Europe? Are Karaites putting their money in it? Certainly the way he's presenting it does not reflect general rabbinite practice. I can guess that he's referring to this heter iska, but again, I don't know what
Are you
they're
saying
doing.
that heter iska was a rare thing in the Middle Ages? I mean,
This is the Middle Ages. Yeah. Well,
all right, the early modern period, whatever, or even
don't
today,
know.
is it such a rare thing?
I don't think it's so common. It's done in certain circumstances, so you can set up it's certainly not done when people just give loans to each other.
Mm-hmm. Small private loans, you're saying it's not done, but we don't know that he's talking about. All right, in any event, so from his perspective, probably or possibly this loophole, he then spins that into they completely ignore it.
I mean, again, if he wanted to describe heter iska and tell you why he thinks it's illegitimate, that'd be fine. That would be totally fine.
This would be like saying, well, in the context of a polemic, I don't know. That's his responsibility.
Well, no, because with some things, like he says, and I think this is a legitimate. This is legitimate. He's talking about carrying on the Sabbath.
Okay.
So he says carrying on the Sabbath is forbidden, and the Rabbinites say carrying on the Sabbath is forbidden.
So he thinks carrying on Shabbat is forbidden.
Yes.
So that's fascinating, because no Karaite today that I know of believes that.
Really?
Really.
Okay. So he says, but the Talmudites have permitted carrying by way of the public domain in wide open places and borders by tying strings and cords to delineate borders of the nations.
Yeah.
That's whatever, to delineate borders. Borders of the nations is because he uses a biblical expression, Ladber gvulot anim, it's a pun on something in Deuteronomy.
Okay. So that's what's called the Eruv, which is...
It's called an Eruv. I want to read my footnote on this.
Okay, yeah.
This is a reference to the rabbinic practice of Eruv. Note that the theological basis behind rabbinic Eruv is not to turn a public street into a private domain, but rather, again, this is what it's supposed to be, but rather to mark certain areas that are already private domains, though in joint ownership of a few people, like an apartment, a co-op. Thus, for example, within a shared courtyard or apartment building, it should theoretically be permitted to carry from the residences into the hallways or into the courtyard and vice versa, because there's no public domain. You're just going from one private domain.
Let me stop you for a minute, because some of the audience is completely confused.
Okay.
So there's in rabbinical Judaism, there's this idea that on Shabbat, the type of labor that's forbidden are these 39 specific acts. And one of those is carrying from a private domain to a public domain, or a public domain to a private domain. There's 4 types of domains in ancient times, right? All right. So the Eruv makes it so you can actually carry outside. That's de facto what it does, right?
De facto. But de jure, what it is it's saying, gee, you got two private domains. We both live in an apartment building, and I have my apartment, and you have your apartment, and they're adjacent. And let's say we have a door between them, or we have a shared hallway. That it's not the street that I can carry from so that we'd say, in theory, that should be permitted anyway. But because it's too similar to carrying in a public domain, so Rabbinite Halacha says that you shouldn't do it unless you put up some kind of this thing called an Eruv.
So like I live in Dallas right now, and there's a string around the Jewish neighborhood. And it's not just shared spaces, it's public streets. So
I go on. Later on, some rabbinic groups came up with the idea that even public streets are not truly public domains in the halachic sense because of some argument. And therefore, they allow the creation of an Eruv of even larger communities, enclosing whole streets or even cities. Other rabbinic groups consider this to be a blatant violation of the Sabbath. And this is often a point of great bitter contention, conflict between different rabbinic groups today not just between Karaites and Rabbinites. This sentence that he wrote, you could have seen in any rabbinic work.
Okay, so let me tell you a little interesting story. Israel, Israel doesn't have a separation between church and state. The religious leaders in Israel, whether they're Muslim or Catholic or Orthodox Jews, they get their salaries from the state of Israel. That comes out of taxes, and the rabbis from the rabbinical community were getting paid more than Karaite religious leaders. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court. And I think the Karaites were getting like 88% the amount of what the Rabbinites were getting, something like that.
What were the Christians and Muslims getting?
I think also probably 88%. I don't know. So this went all the way to the Supreme Court of Israel. And the court ruled, they said, well, you Karaites don't need as much money because you don't have as certain burdens that the rabbis, the Rabbanut, the chief rabbinate, spends its money on. And one of the major things it spends its money on is the Eruv. And so for that extra 12% is to cover the Eruv. So this is actually an official institution of the rabbinical establishment in the state of Israel. You're saying any rabbinite could have written that. I don't know if is that really true. Maybe
anybody in my community. And listen, in my community in New York. So there was no Eruv here for many, many years because the rabbis opposed it. The rabbis of one of the communities in the neighborhood, which was very powerful. Eventually, in 2006, must have been 2006. I remember it. They rabbis from other communities in the neighborhood got together and they put one up. So in the communities that follow the rabbis that opposed it, you go to any of their synagogues and there are big signs that this is to remind everybody that an Eruv absolutely cannot be constructed in the streets of New York City, that any carrying is, that is this completely illegitimate, absolutely do not carry anything into the synagogue or out of it. And it's a real, if you'll pardon the term, boundary line, because that's what it is between communities. Yes, and this is what he's saying. This is just blatant violation of the Sabbath, and that because what the Eruv was meant to be was, as I said, it's so that you can carry from one person's apartment to another, which should be permitted anyway. The Eruv was meant as a stringency to allow what was already permitted, not as a leniency to allow what was forbidden.
So you're saying today in 2022, there's a lot of rabbinical Jews who are opposed to Eruv. And so here this Karaite in the early 18th century who's opposed to Eruv and accuses the Rabbinites of doing it. This could also be an internal rabbinical argument, although it sounds like he didn't know that. It sounds like the rabbinical Jews who lived in his area used Eruvs, and he wasn't aware that there was any opposition.
Right. It's not at all clear what he knows and doesn't know.
Okay.
All right. And certainly when we get to part 3, where he's talking about like beliefs, then he's attacking all sorts of beliefs that, again, you could have seen within the.
So what's an example of that? What are some beliefs he's attacking?
So he doesn't like the book Shi'ur Koma. Shi'ur Koma is a very strange. You've heard of it, yes?
Absolutely.
Did it come up in like your work with like the Tetragrammaton, or you just knew of it?
No. Kirkisani talks about it.
Yeah, great.
And other Karaite authors. So look, this was.
You know who else hated Shi'ur Koma and thought that the book was absolutely terrible, should be burned? Maimonides.
Okay, so
like you're.
Look, so in a sense, Maimonides. This is my take on his history. I think Maimonides and Saadia Gaon and folks like that were a way of rabbinites saying, you know what, those Karaites are right. If we want to shore up our defenses, we have to speak out rather than defending what they're right about. If you can't beat them, join them, and that will take the wind out of the sails of the Karaite argument, because we'll agree with them because they're right anyway. I think that
maybe, but you'd have to see who first critiques Shi'ur Koma. You'd have to see who it's not really a rabbinite work any more than it's a Karaite work. It doesn't.
Really?
What?
Shiur Kama
Yes.
is not a rabbinite work?
I wouldn't say so. It's a
Okay.
it's a Jewish work.
All right, so
of
tell
some
everybody
weird-
what Shiur Kama is.
No, and I do want to say what it does do.
Yeah.
I believe, but I'm not even sure if it makes use of names of rabbinite rabbis. If so, it's pseudographic because these are rabbis who lived long earlier. It's not a first century work. And the name, the rabbis, it's not like giving names of later rabbis. It's Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva who became heroes of mystical texts with no connection to Mishnah and Talmud. I mean, the names are used. And this text, I don't want to say it's not used by rabbinites, but I would totally not be surprised if I found some group of Karaites that was really into Shiur Kama. Because
I would doubt that.
I wouldn't be
Kabbalah,
surprised.
yes, there were definitely Karaites who got involved in Kabbalah, especially in later periods. So
I would not be surprised. I would not be surprised.
So tell us what Shiur Kama is.
Shiur Kama is a text that gives dimensions of the various parts of the Godhead. The arms, the legs, the eyes, all of which, by the way, are mentioned in Scripture. It says God's hands did whatever, God's eyes.
In a sense, it's a midrash on Song of Songs.
Song of Songs, right.
Where there's Solomon and his lover, and then the body parts are described. So Shiur Kama says, well, how big were they? Well,
right.
In reference to God. Okay. So, and this was really low-hanging fruit for a Karaite to criticize the rabbinites on, because the idea to a rationalist is abominable that God not only has a body, but we can talk about the size of his arm and the size of his leg.
Correct. But do you have to be a rationalist to be a Karaite? Certainly not later.
No, I think there were rabbinites who, like I said, jumped on the bandwagon because they're like, these guys got a point.
Yes, but I'm saying the opposite. I said, do you have to be a rationalist to be a Karaite?
No.
Not in all periods.
No, but we're talking about in the 8th century and the 9th century when definitely the Karaites were rationalists. Maybe not all of them, but...
Maybe not all of them.
Yeah.
Again, I think this is more a rationalist, non-rationalist, rationalist, mystic.
And I think Rambam or Maimonides at one place talks about that fool who says God has a body. And I once heard he's talking about Rashi.
Well, no, he hadn't heard. He almost certainly hadn't heard of Rashi, so definitely not.
All right.
And so Maimonides in his youth, I believe it's about Shiur Kama, that Maimonides in his youth says it's a really weird text and it must be metaphorical. And then later in his life, he said, this is just garbage.
Okay. Interesting. All right. So you're saying that the Karaites are criticizing rabbinites for things that the rabbinites themselves criticize other rabbinites for.
Yes.
Okay. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Are there any things there that he criticizes that are very unexpected?
Ooh. Let me tell some first the things that are expected because your audience might not know them.
Yeah.
He talks about that rabbinites don't allow cooking any milk with any meat in any milk. And he says that, we Karaites don't hold by this. We say that you can't cook meat in milk of the mother, the animal that gave birth to that animal.
Okay.
And he says, and we're very careful about this. We don't even use the same pots. We have separate pots, which is something I've never heard from other Karaite sources. We have separate pots for that of the animal. When we know the milk came from a specific animal, we don't use that pot.
And you mean a specific individual animal, not a species?
Correct.
Okay.
Specific on an individual animal. Because rabbinites famously won't use the same pot for any milk, for any
meat and any milk, right?
Correct.
So if there's any milk, whether it's from a goat, a cow, or a sheep, and it's touched a pot, then they won't use that pot for any meat, whether it's been cooked in chicken.
Cooked in a pot, yeah.
Okay. And you're saying this Karaite, that's interesting. So that actually kind of reflects the rural world that he came from.
That what?
because I couldn't tell you which sheep my sheep's milk came from or goat's
Right.
milk came from.
Correct.
He actually
Correct.
they were getting their milk directly, I guess. Must be.
Yeah, clearly.
From animals
yeah.
who they knew by sight or by name. Probably not by name, but by
Either
sight.
that, or I mean, that's clearly what's going
Or he's
on.
making
I'm
this whole
saying
thing
either
up.
that, or they're getting special Karaite stamps saying that this came from Bessie, and that this milk came from Bessie,
It
and
could
then
be.
unlikely.
That's unlikely, but it could be.
I
don't
think
know.
they're living in small town. As I said, what was it that the king of Poland or the duke of the area, that the prince, the son of the king, wanted to make this city into something, and like it was a dump. Like,
All right.
I mean, maybe that would be interesting. It would work. So that's one thing. Or we talked about Lulav, where he says we understand it as he says the Rabbinites understand these four species as species that you use to do a separate mitzvah, a separate commandment from Sukkah, that you pick them up. And he says, we Karaites don't do that. We build the Sukkah with them. But he has a problem because in his community they don't build the Sukkah with them. Okay. Neither do they use them to pick up and shake, nor do they
and does he say that?
use them to build a sukkah. So he says, because these species are not found in our lands, they, the Rabbinites, permit violation of the Sabbath and eating of forbidden foods in order to obtain. But
what does that
ours
mean?
So listen to my footnote. Again, part of the fun of this book is my footnotes, because I unpack it. It's really, as you say, what on earth does that mean? So I write, this claim is very strange. Presumably, he means that Rabbinites go through countries where it is impossible to observe the Sabbath or obtain kosher food, just to obtain these species. However, in fact, no Rabbinite rabbis would approve of such behavior. Rabbinite halacha does not permit even carrying the species to the synagogue on the Sabbath, because it would be carrying, let alone eating non-kosher food in order to obtain them. See also Tosfot Yom Tov, commentary on the Mishnah by Yom Tov Lipman Heller, lived in Prague, 1579 to 1654, on Mishnah Rosh Hashanah. The Mishnah there states that one may not violate any of the restrictions of the festival in order to obtain a shofar. And Heller notes that the same applies to obtaining the species of vegetation for Sukkot. Now, it is possible that there were rogue people whose business was to obtain the four species for Sukkot, who then had to leave those countries and had to go to countries, had to get to countries where it was impossible to observe the Sabbath or to get kosher food, the most famous such country being Spain, because Spain had expelled its Jews hundreds of years later, and it was a very Catholic country, and any kind of observance, public observance, certainly of Judaism was punishable, probably by death. And we know that Jewish businessmen who went there definitely did violate the Sabbath and eat non-kosher food when they were there. We know this went on.
Where do we know that from?
What?
Where do we know that from?
I know it from graduate school, from Professor Elisha Karlbach's class on early modern Judaism.
But do we have texts where there's some merchant who talks about, well, I went to Spain and I had to eat pork because I didn't want him to kill me? Or do you think?
I think so, but I told you where I heard it from. You can Google Elisha Karlbach,
So it's an interesting question. So when there was a Jewish...
did it go on? I'm not saying it didn't go on. However, if it did go on, I don't think he would have known about it very well, because we know, unlike certainly in Egypt and in the Byzantine Empire, the Jews in Eastern Europe were the Karaites and Rabbinites really didn't interact that much. The communities were separate. And so I really don't think this is the kind of thing he would have had direct knowledge of. And it's not something, I'm not saying it didn't go on. I have no idea what went on. It may go on today.
So let me ask this question. Do you know anything about, and I don't know the answer to this, when there were Jews, for example, like traveling on the Silk Road or engaging in international mercantile activities, how did they observe Shabbat? And maybe it's just a question to ask rather than to answer.
I don't know. It is a really good question.
Yeah.
But you know what? There's a parallel today.
Mhm.
Jews go on business to the Far East, let's say.
Yeah.
And these are Jews who are observant in their lives at home. So they want to observe the Sabbath. They want to get kosher food.
Yeah.
Some of them will seek out, usually there's a Chabad house,
Yeah.
which is, how would I explain what a Chabad is? Chabad is a group of, it's one Hasidic sect, which has made Jewish outreach a big point of what they do. And they set up houses all around the world to where people can get kosher food and keep the Sabbath. Again, but there are probably plenty of places in the Far East where there is no Chabad house.
Do you know where the largest annual Passover Seder in the world is?
It's in, what's it called?
It's in Kathmandu.
In Kathmandu, that's right.
And
That's
it's
right.
held by Chabad.
You've probably been there, right?
I've been to Kathmandu, but not for Pesach.
Yeah, not for Passover. Yeah,
This has been wonderful. Thanks so much, Gabriel, for joining us. And this has been a wonderful conversation. Not the kind of conversation the audience would normally have access to. So I really want to thank you.
Thanks.
You have been listening to Hebrew Voices with Nehemiah Gordon. Thank you for supporting Nehemiah's Makor Hebrew Foundation. Learn more at nehemiahswall.com.